Welcome to this edition of Fuel for Thought. I'm Mark Rechtin, Executive Editor of S&P Global Mobility. While much of the public-facing fuss about the electrification of the vehicle fleet involves personal transportation, it is the realm of commercial vehicles where the real emissions cleaning can happen. We all know diesel-powered trucks, everything from neighborhood delivery vans to the big rigs that ply our freeways, are far more polluting per mile driven than the average automobile. While the delivery trucks and tractor trailers that distribute goods and cargo make up only 5% of vehicles on U.S. roads, they are the largest single contributor to mobile source nitrogen oxide emissions in the U.S., as well as particulate matter, according to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. But people need food and appliances, toys, and Air Jordans, and we know that hauling the world's commerce, from cases of soda to lumber to television sets, takes robust, high-torque powertrains. And until recently, that's meant diesel. In attempting to evolve from diesel, both via government regulation and by technological leaps, we are seeing the rise of alternative power plants, either propelled by battery electricity or hydrogen. But both, as of now, have serious limitations. In today's episode of Fuel for Thought, we'll be looking deeper into this issue. Joining us today are two commercial vehicle subject matter experts from S&P Global Mobility, Andrej Divis, Research and Analysis Executive Director, and James Martin, Consulting Associate Director. Good day to you both. Let's start with Andrej. Let's paint a quick near and medium-term picture of federal regulations, as well as the California state regulations that tend to be a canary in the coal line for the federal level. I guess the upshot is, are commercial vehicle fleet owners really facing the death of diesel, and what sort of sunset are we looking at here?
The answer is we are in a phase of significant transition in the industry. And as you alluded to by touching on some of the regulations, some of the pace of change is indeed being shaped and accelerated by the regulations. Very briefly, we expect to see an acceleration in the zero emission share of U.S. new truck registrations rise from about 1% or even below 1% in 2022 to slightly over a quarter of new registrations in medium and heavy trucks by 2030. The flip side of that, though, is this isn't the death of diesel, because obviously, if just over a quarter are zero emission by 2030, the rest of the market we still expect to be either gasoline or diesel powered internal combustion engines. Still, we do think that transition will continue to accelerate from there. And then by 2035, we might see the diesel and gasoline share drop as low as 60%.
Okay, so that still is a lot of diesel left to play with in the market. And I think a lot of manufacturers have countered these technology forcing measures by stating that the tech isn't ready for prime time. It'll cost too much, et cetera, et cetera. And OEMs have often won lengthy delays with these tactics, especially if there's the possibility of dealing with a future administration that doesn't believe in climate change. What are the chances that these regulations will stick?
Right. Before answering that question directly, I want to just sort of agree with, or rather underline one of the other points you made, mentioning that the technology may not be ready and so on. And I think some of those concerns are behind why we think, the pace of change can't be 100% by 2030. Trucks are critical to the nation. They deliver the almost three quarters of the nation's freight. They're very, very important. They need to have a reliable technology behind them to transport all those goods, get them where they need to go on time, both for us consumers and also for industry. And so there are some limits to how quickly we can see change take place. Having said that, though, to answer the question directly, we think that the fundamental regulatory landscape is unlikely to be changed greatly, but some adjustment around the edges, if you will, or in the details may be possible. Very briefly, we're looking at a couple different kinds of regulations. We're looking at sort of established federal law. We're looking at state law that's also established, and then we're looking at pending legislation. When we're looking at established law at the federal level, probably the most relevant piece of legislation is the so-called greenhouse gas phase 2 rules, which regulate CO2 emissions out to model year 2028. We certainly don't expect those to be relaxed. It's actually possible those might be tightened in the later years of the rule. Similarly, there is legislation in place in California, which is actually pushing the transition away from diesel and gasoline even more rapidly than federal legislation. And that's also shared across states that are following California. It's actually a very timely question. The state of California just negotiated a deal with some of the manufacturers and other industry participants, sort of fine tuning the application of their proposed legislation. Under the terms of the deal, the zero emission vehicle targets remain the same, but some of the details of the implementation are changed. Now that that detail is done and signed on to by the industry, we don't expect any changes there. Where we think there could be changes might be possibly in the as yet not final greenhouse gas phase 3 regulation, which would run through model year 2032. The comment period has ended. The final rule is not issued. So it's possible we'll see some movement there. And I think the other thing that could happen potentially, the Inflation Reduction Act is very impactful for the industry in a number of different ways, both in terms of tax credits supporting the purchase of zero emission vehicles by fleets, but also in some other areas, specifically supports to the production of hydrogen. One thing that could happen through the political process potentially is we could see maybe spending caps added that could actually change the influence on the industry. But again, that's sort of a modification of the regulatory landscape rather than putting a new rule in place. So the industry fundamentally likes stability. And I think if you talk to the manufacturers and hear them speak at public events, that they spend a lot of time underlining the same thing. It's very difficult to plan when things are changing. And so I think the industry itself will probably be in favor of a degree of stability as well.
So let's bring James into the conversation. Andre earlier mentioned that we were looking at about a quarter to a third of the overall market being potentially hydrogen or battery electric. And that's about 140,000 non-diesel units per year arriving within a decade. That's a pretty monumental leap. Who do you see as the leaders in this technology race that's supposed to supply all these trucks? I mean, Elon Musk provides plenty of noise and headlines for his battery-powered Tesla Semi, and Rivian is contributing its neighborhood electric delivery vehicles, and you hear a lot about Nikola and their hydrogen trucks. But all these companies have delivered just a handful of vehicles. How close are they to getting full-scale assembly established?
What we're starting to see right now, there are a number of companies that we call disruptors, and they're basically trying to follow the model that Tesla set for passenger vehicles and apply that to medium and heavy duty vehicles. And several of them are poised now to enter the market with class 4, class 5, class 6 type product, and they'll get to market in most cases before the more traditional, more legacy commercial vehicle makers get there, but they won't get there, of course, with volume like what we do see from the legacy makers. Should the product actually stick? Should it become sticky in market and we see fleets and companies consuming that product, then we think that most of the legacy manufacturers can pivot fairly quickly. They're already working on solutions in those areas. There'll be some pressure on those new disruptors to start the business and then stay in business. One thing that would help those disruptors, and we talked a bit about the regulations and also a little bit about incentives, primarily from the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. There's some pretty significant incentives that can help both the legacy makers and the disruptor makers in those classes. But one other thing that we're seeing in the market, a number of users of vehicles in these classes, and especially Class 8 semis, are companies that control large fleets but have also made significant pledges to carbon neutrality. Now, carbon neutrality is interesting in that it's not an overt regulation. It's primarily a self-set guideline that some of these companies have to reduce their carbon emissions. And to do so, one path is to reduce their emissions due to transportation. And so it's impacting how they spend money on fleets to transport their products. So that's also one piece that is likely to be, if you would, administration proof, because these are not regulations or incentives that are driven by an administration. They're driven by internal company policy.
So we're talking about the supply side of bringing these vehicles to market, but someone has to buy these trucks. And James, you did mention the idea of carbon neutrality. but who's actually signing on the dotted line and placing a large scale order for these kinds of green trucks? And I'll let James continue with this one. Who do you see as being ideal first movers in the operating field for where this tech makes a good fit? Who runs a fleet of sufficient size so that we can hit those 140,000 vehicles that are supposed to be non-diesel by 2030?
Most everyone has seen, that Amazon is a large consumer of electric commercial vehicles, and they've got the deal going with Rivian where they're going to provide, or Rivian is going to provide to Amazon up to 100,000 zero emissions vans. But other goods companies like PepsiCo, Anheuser-Busch, Walmart, that supply the products that we use and consume on a daily basis and move that product in very heavy capacity. There are semi fleets that are controlled by those companies because of the amount of product that they're using, and they all have very significant contractual agreements with builders of electric vehicles to provide Class 8 semis, also Class 7 vehicles, and Class 2 and 3 vans to transport their product not only interstate but also locally, depot to depot.
So back to Andre. There are a lot of companies that are making these promises and companies that want to deliver these vehicles to those companies, but the trucks have to actually work in the established freight hauling duty cycle. What kind of technology and network impediments stand in the way of widespread battery or hydrogen adoption?
The major technological impediments are really about range and recharging. And I think tied to range I really should say depletion of the battery. Driving a long ways is one thing. Also, obviously, a very intense use of the power can also do it. So I think, there are applications in the vocational space, in the long haul space, where we see limitations with current technology. And I think that's sort of compounded by some of the infrastructure concerns that are often mentioned, which basically boil down to the fact that if you have a battery electric truck, a tractor trailer, or a vocational truck, or what have you, or a hydrogen powered truck, there's not a lot of places, certainly not public places, where you can recharge those vehicles. So I think those are going to be two limitations. I think over time, we'll probably see both of them lifted. Technology will obviously develop and the infrastructure will be built out. But right now, those are serving as limiters.
So it's time to put both of you on the spot with a little role playing exercise. And we'll start with Andre. Let's say you're the CEO of an established commercial vehicle manufacturer. You know the bell is tolling for diesel, and the percentage of your business that could go to diesel as opposed to alternative propulsion is going to shrink. Do you roll the dice with your capex on batteries or hydrogen or some other green tech option, or do you hope that the glide path for diesel will let you survive? And why?
That is the question facing the leadership of many of today's established commercial vehicle manufacturers. And I think I'll respond by kind of observing about some of the things that are being done, which are probably also what I would do. There is a consensus that new technologies need to be developed, and certainly in future the industry will be powered to a great extent by these new technologies. But there's a lot of questions around the pace of change, and there's a lot of variables that can influence that pace of change. And if I'm the manager of a company, I've got to hedge my bets. So I think I put a lot of resources on the new technologies that I believe are going to give a competitive edge. Probably try to keep critical technologies in house again because of the competitive aspect. But we know we have an existing ICE business that's not going to go away overnight. I'm going to try to make that one more efficient, maybe simplify somewhat. And I'll also note one thing that we're seeing is that today's managers of commercial vehicle manufacturers, there are partnerships evolving to try to lower the capital burden to continue to play in the diesel space or even undertake some of these new projects. So that would be another possible option to meet all the priorities.
James, your turn. You're the CEO of a long haul truck operator with an aging fleet. Knowing you need to get 15 years or more out of your next round of trucks for them to amortize, do you spin the wheel on diesel once more, hoping regulations get watered down so you can get a full life cycle out of these trucks? Or do you split your purchase on some unproven new green tech that has little infrastructure in place and no durability data?
At this stage of the development of technology, as well as the stages of rollout of regulation, you've got to spin the wheel a bit, but I think you have to do it selectively and surgically. We do have a number of states, 7, I think, at last count, that are committing to follow the California Air Resources Board advanced clean truck legislation. And to play in those states, you've got to have some amount of zero emissions fleet. So you've got to carve off a bit of the investment to at least target fleet operations in those states. But you cannot, at this point in time, walk away from diesel until the infrastructure is in place to assure that an electric powered vehicle and or a hydrogen powered vehicle can travel coast to coast with charging and refueling for hydrogen. You can't put all your chips on those squares. You've got to keep diesel. It becomes more of a how much scale do I commit to the zero emission side of it, knowing that I've got to do something there, if for no other reason than to do business in those states that are following the CARB ACT.
Well, obviously, we've just scratched the surface of this issue, and we could delve into many more related issues confronting the commercial vehicle side of the industry, but our time is up. Thanks to our experts for joining us today, and thanks to you for listening. That was a lot to unpack, but I hope you all feel smarter and more informed for having tuned in. And if so, please share this podcast link with your colleagues and in your social media accounts. And to opt in to our newsletter that provides more information on this topic and others, please visit spglobal.com/mobility. And if you want to learn more about this topic, please feel free to reach out to us at that same web address. We'll be back with more Fuel for Thought next month.